Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta, and we're getting into the nitty-gritty of Seattle's urban development for this episode. Library volunteer Rick Sipe interviews his neighbor, Tom J. Phillips, about his book, High Point, the inside story of Seattle's first green mixed-income neighborhood. Phillips didn't just write about High Point, which is now one of Seattle's most diverse neighborhoods. He helped develop it as its senior project manager. He and Rick talk about the effects of redlining in Seattle, the history of the neighborhood, and the work it took to reinvent High Point from the ground up. If you're at all curious about Seattle history, or you're a city planning nerd like I am, I think you'll enjoy this conversation. Here it is without further ado.
Today, we're honored to have as our guest Tom Phillips, the author of High Point, the inside story of Seattle's first green mixed-income neighborhood. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Oh, good. Yeah. Tom, I'd like to start today with a bit about your personal background. Tell us about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Seattle, and my professional career had me working and living in other places around the country. I had moved back to Seattle in 1975, and I had a national consulting business, and my interest was in communities and how to make them work better. Primarily, I worked on citizen involvement projects, how to get whoever was being affected by what our plans were, how to get them involved and have them tell us what they were thinking and how to improve what we were doing. And that ended up as a consulting business working for developers and help them figure out what they should build, particularly residential communities. And what they wanted, what the people who were going to live there wanted, and we got down to even issues like how important is a dining room table, and how important is it to build a house that can accommodate somebody's dining room table when they move into this new community. And surprisingly, that ended up being very useful for the Seattle Housing Authority, because the Housing Authority was in the process in the 2000s, early 2000s, of rebuilding many of their old World War II communities.
Mm-hmm. And did you go to school here in Seattle?
I did not go to school here. I went to college in Massachusetts, and then I went to graduate school in New York City at the New School for Social Research.
And what made you decide to come back to Seattle?
Oh, I think I always knew I would come back.
Uh-huh.
I had been gone for like 12 years, and it just was my home. I just had I just loved growing up here, and the other thing that happened is Seattle got bigger while I was gone, and I liked that. There was a lot more cosmopolitan.
I see.
That means restaurants.
That's good. So, as a young man, as a teenager, even growing up here, were you familiar with High Point?
No, I wasn't. I used to do a little coaching of baseball, and this was as an adult, and some touch football, and we would occasionally have a game over in High Point, and I happened to I looked around once and couldn't quite figure out what it was, but I knew it existed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So High Point, as I understand, was a World War II, post-World War II project, if you will, of low-income housing. And there are other high points in the Seattle area, right?
Right. Yeah, there are other communities that sort of were built at the same time as what was then the Defense Department helped the Seattle Housing Authority and other housing authorities build basically World War II workers' housing, and for housing for Rosie the Riveter, and there were projects like it in King County and Bremerton, Tacoma, other places in the region.
Mm-hmm. So these were not originally built as low income, but rather
defense worker housing.
Housing.
Yeah, that's exactly what they were, to meet the shortage. And it wasn't until after the war that the Defense Department, what was then called the War Department, I believe, turned the projects back over to the Seattle Housing Authority, who had been involved in building them. So the housing itself was recognized as temporary housing when it was built, which when we got around to 2000 meant that the housing was not in very good shape. And not only was the housing itself in bad shape, but the infrastructure that supported the housing, the streets, the sewers, were pretty worn out. So it really needed a remake. And that's what we were doing at the national level. There was a whole effort to rebuild a lot of deteriorated, outdated, dilapidated housing. And so there was an insertion of money from the administration to make that possible. It wouldn't have happened without some substantial funding from the federal government.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say High Point was regarded by the other residents of Seattle?
Well, that turns out to be, when I was hired in 2001, turned out to be a major obstacle and a major challenge that I faced, because High Point had a terrible reputation, particularly bad in West Seattle, because in the 90s, partly the crack cocaine epidemic manifests itself at High Point. So it was a very high crime area. It turns out that that's the reputation it had, and it had the bad reputation in West Seattle. It turns out that the people who lived there, they knew it was dangerous, but they kind of were fond of it. It was an existing community that they had lived in for some time and raised their kids there, and they had fond memories of it, even though the neighborhood in West Seattle, they had enough of it. And I spent a lot of time talking to those neighbors, and they had lots of stories to tell me about all the problems that existed. But that issue of the bad reputation was a major challenge that I faced, because High Point, the economics of High Point were such that we could build the low-income housing, rebuild the streets and the infrastructure and everything like that. And we didn't get enough money to do that, so we needed to sell back some of the land. But we had to, in the process, add value to the site, which meant that we would end up building for sale housing, middle income housing. And the way our project was being funded, our big way it was being funded, is that we would make money on selling the houses to middle income families. So if we couldn't change the reputation and the look and feel of High Point, then we wouldn't have enough money to do the project. So it was a big challenge to change the perception of what High Point was in West Seattle, so buyers would come in and pay decent money, kind of average home price in West Seattle. And that was a big challenge and something we ended up being quite successful with.
Good. So in 2001, you were offered this position of the senior project manager for High Point. Did you have any idea what a daunting task this was really going to be?
They asked me that at the interview, and I said, well, one of the projects I had was trying to help a developer build next to a nuclear waste dump in Utah. So I told them that, I had that experience at least. I knew how big it was, and I had actually spent the previous 10 years working with developers, housing developers, on projects around the country. And so I knew it was tough. I knew it was a challenge to do that. But adding, building a new community with houses for people to buy is a real challenge. Adding on top of that this reputation that the High Point had was just another element of that challenge. But we recognized it and took it on. I found out a little ways into the project that this neighborhood in West Seattle had been what they called redlined in the 30s by the banking community, which means that the people buying in that community had trouble getting loans and qualifying for loans, and it was hard to get the housing prices that seemed right for the rest of the city in a former redline community. So it wasn't just the reputation that we had from the 90s in that area, but it was that had happened in the 30s, the redlining. I occasionally forget that, and people would remind me that people like Greg Nichols, who was the former mayor. He was the mayor when we were doing the project, but he was kind of a student of history, and he would comment about those issues occasionally, and he was very pleased with what had happened at High Point. We gave him tours. He was very interested in what our plans were, so he would come and his aides and bring his wife along. We'd give them progress tours as we went along.
So redlining, that's something that happened in other parts of Seattle as well.
Yeah, and where you and I live right now was actually a red line area on Capitol Hill. Other places in the south end of Seattle, and this particular spot in Del Ridge, High Point in West Seattle. And for a long time, I mean, people, when we mention redlining, we think, oh, it's just something everybody knew about. But it turns out that banks didn't even want to acknowledge later, even in the 70s, that it existed. And it was only more recently that the redlining maps about Seattle were discovered and were published. They're still not easy to find.
Mm-hmm. And so, not to belabor the issue about redlining, but it's my understanding that redlining actually created, by its own methodology, created the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, in West Seattle, the dividing line was 35th Avenue Southwest. If your house was on the west side of 35th, then it wasn't a red line neighborhood. If it was on the east side of 35th, so basically it was harder for people to get loans if they were in the red line area, and it really had a dampening effect on the price of housing.
Right. Yeah. So Tom, your title as senior project manager. When we think of project management, or at least when I think of project management, I kind of think about, just someone with a bunch of schedules and tasks, and you're basically looking at the task and looking at the schedule and trying to get the two to be completed on time. But in your book, it seems that the project manager role was much more about collaboration. Can you talk a little bit about how that worked for you or didn't work?
Yeah, one of the things, I forget now how much I talk about it, but as I said, this was a national program to redo old housing, and a community in Portland also got a grant to do this work, and they hired a guy who was a transportation planner, and he was he was going to get that train built, and so it was just, you just do it as fast as you possibly can, and I took on a different perspective on that. I really got that we needed to bring everybody along, and everybody included not just the neighbors, but the neighbors who lived adjacent to what's present-day High Point, but also the people who lived at High Point. Right when we started, there were low-income families living there. Now we were going to force them to relocate, to move from their house, and to the extent we could, offer them a place to live in Seattle and back at High Point if they wanted to come back. That takes time, and all of this takes time, and it just felt like an organic process. And so we started to have some people move, started tearing down some of the old units, but it was a very slow process because we knew that it was just a very touchy issue. Well, one of the decisions we made very early was to make the project green and make it as energy efficient as possible. For example, one of the things that takes a longer time is we did some deconstruction of some of the units, and deconstruction is actually the reverse of building a house. We actually took it apart slowly and saved a lot of the material. And it turned out that it cost about the same as demolishing, but it's much slower. To do it slower, it meant we couldn't meet our deadlines that HUD had imposed on us, or would be too off the schedule that they imposed on us. So we ended up demolishing the units rather than deconstructing them.
Well, I must say, in reading the book myself, it's a real tribute to your negotiating skills, your ability to be patient with people and to really try to include all of the stakeholders. It really stands out in the book that this is how you do it. It's almost, if I might, it's almost a case study in how real project management needs to be done. It's not just about schedule and task.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Congratulations for that.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for recognizing that. It does take a lot of patience. I remember we had a lot of committees. One of the committees was made up of stakeholders in West Seattle, just people who were involved in various ways in West Seattle. It was a committee of about 30, 40 people, and we would meet every 4 or 5 months and go over what our plans were. And this was part of the notion that people need to understand what you're doing in order to be supportive. Otherwise, they're going to be opposed to what you're going to do, and the rumors would come around. So I ended up becoming a regular presenter at the West Seattle Chamber of Commerce. And then whatever else I could find, the Kiwanis or other groups in West Seattle, I would go out and meet with them and show them what we were doing. And people, their initial reaction was, well, we're opposed to what you're doing. But over time, as they got to know what our plans were and could see the architectural drawings and everything else we were doing, they ended up supportive of what we were doing. Of course, a big challenge was the low-income residents who were living in High Point, and what their reaction was going to be. And I remember we were trying to decide on the carpets that we're going to have in the units. And I remember we had a committee of residents, and they took their shoes off and walked on the various carpets to see what they were like and give us a recommendation what would work best. And in the long run, that really paid off to just spend time listening and sharing ideas and hearing what they had to say. You know, some of the stuff we did, which is one of my favorite techniques, is show images of what the housing might look like or what it might not look like, and get people's reaction to what they wanted it to look like. And we used that to get feedback to the architects, and we ended up having them design what looked like big houses. But in some ways, these big houses were duplexes and triplexes, but they looked like a friendly community with steep roofs and front porches, nice windows, and colorful paints. So, we knew what people were comfortable with. In doing this work of showing images to people, I've learned over time that communities are very unique. They have their own set of ideas. I mean, it doesn't matter too much that the people living at High Point were low income, and this was a neighborhood they were kind of forced to live in because it was one of the places where you could live in the city of Seattle. But it turns out the people the low income people in West Seattle had very similar ideas about what the housing should look like to neighbors who lived there. And what we discovered was that to live in West Seattle, or this part of West Seattle, you had a set of values that were very traditional in terms of what housing should look like. It turns out that because I was kind of the expert on outreach and at the Seattle Housing Authority, the Housing Authority was doing a similar redevelopment at Rainier Vista in Rainier Valley. And Rainier Vista is a very different place. So they had me do some of the same outreach programs, asking residents what they wanted their housing to look like. At Rainier Vista, the residents wanted more modern housing. You didn't have to have steep roofs or front porches, but they were open to different ideas. And in West Seattle, they weren't. So that the housing we built reflects the values of the people living in West Seattle, and the housing at Rainier Vista reflects the values of people who were living there.
There's, it seems, a stigma that's attached to a place like High Point. It's a place for poor people. It's a place for immigrants. It's a place for people that can't get a job. Did you ever consider changing the name?
That was something we spent a lot of time talking about. When you have a project like this, you have the luxury of hiring consultants, because the consultants are a small fraction of your budget. And so we had a very talented outreach expert, and we asked her if we should change the name, because a similar project actually in Highline had changed its name. And Rainier Vista, they changed that name a little. But in the end, we decided that High Point actually meant something. It is the highest point in West Seattle, actually the highest point in Seattle. And people who grown up there and who were still living there, low-income families, were very fond of High Point, even though it had a dangerous reputation. But they had good memories about High Point, and they didn't want us to change the name. So we said, okay, we're going to have to just change the community and let that happen, and make the change that way rather than in the name. So we kept the name.
Let's talk about grocery stores.
Yeah.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most about the book really was your when you talked about trying to get a grocery store in the area, and how maybe things didn't quite work out. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, they definitely did not work out. There is not a grocery store at High Point. I was just starting the job. I was into it by like 2 or 3 months when I heard that Albertsons wanted to build a grocery store at High Point. And I was all excited about that prospect, because in the application to get the funding, the residents had asked for a grocery store, and if we could deliver a grocery store, it would really be a positive thing to happen. Now, I'm going to tell this story partly because it's not in the book, but we were approached by Albertsons and a developer working with Albertsons, a developer who had experience building grocery stores in other communities where housing was already built, and they could do a mixed-use project, a project with a grocery store in the ground floor and housing above it. And they expressed interest to come in to High Point and have a meeting with us. So we did meet with them, and you never know what it is that kind of is a problem and gets in the way. But my boss at the time had worked for this developer, and he was, like anybody in government, high up in government, he was very sensitive to the issue of if we hired this developer who had come to us, we hadn't sought him out. If we hired him, it would look like we were doing favoritism for somebody to make money. Now, he happened to be a really good problem solver, and he could have figured out better than I could about how to get Albertsons to build the building that we were interested in, as opposed to one that was just a building at the back of the lot with parking in front, which is what we didn't want to happen. But because he didn't want his name associated with this, he didn't want to be involved in it, he didn't attend the meetings where we were talking about how to make this grocery store work. And what we wanted was, we wanted a grocery store with parking underneath, but not a big parking lot on 35th in front of the building. And Albertsons said no, they weren't going to do that. That was not something that they did. And it turns out, if you look around town, the Albertsons, that is not something they don't do. Other grocery stores do this. But I was kind of naive about being able to influence them to build something that didn't have a big parking lot in front of it. So I took a stand with them, and they said, okay, well, we're gone. We're out of here. And that was, 5 months into the project. And I think it would have improved High Point a lot to have a grocery store. And I think it was probably a mistake, but it was kind of just strange circumstances that happened, that my boss happened to have this relationship with the developer. So we don't have a grocery store, our very small grocery store, and it was something that people really wanted to have in that part of West Seattle.
When we talk about High Point and the name and the fact that it is the highest point in West Seattle, I'd like, if you will, to actually describe what High Point looks like, and then what might one see if they're at High Point?
Well, what High Point looks like now is I think one of the really big successes of my work and the Housing Authority's work. We had gotten the city to agree with us to have relatively narrow streets, so it's not all asphalt. And we had a very aggressive tree planting program, and then there was a whole effort to amend the soil so it could accommodate the overflow of water. And it turns out that doing that made trees grow very fast. So if you go to High Point now, it's hard to believe those trees were planted in like 2005, because it looks like a very mature community with these big trees and beautiful streets. So what it looks like now, in some ways, a mature suburban community, because a lot of the trees are similar, and it's just very tidy and just looks really good, really green, and people live there really do like it.
What views do they have?
Well, I lived there for about 5 years, and we were very aware of the views because we lived on the east side where the views are back toward the city of Seattle and Puget Sound. So they're spectacular views. Of course, we have the views of the Cascades from there also. So the Cascades, downtown, Puget Sound, the Seattle skyline. And also, if you get to the right places, you can also have some views out to the east, to the Olympics. So it's a really spectacular site.
Great. Good. So you and your wife, Julie, moved to High Point.
Yeah.
As the senior project manager of High Point, I applaud the fact that you actually lived there, but I almost think it might have been a little awkward for you at times. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think the biggest problem was what I would pay for the house, or what we would pay for the house, because the program or the way High Point worked is the Housing Authority built the low-income housing, and then we would package up a certain number of lots and sell them to private builders who would then be on their own to using some guidelines from us, but would build the housing and the private housing and sell it. Now, the problem that presents for me is, do I try and get a better deal? Do I pay what what the list price is, or do I go try and negotiate it because we would be accused of favoritism in some way? And so I just chose to just pay whatever the price was. And I think my neighbors, negotiated the price with that particular builder. So that was awkward. Otherwise, not a lot of people knew kind of who I was in the neighborhood, and so they only rarely would bother us about what was some problem that was going on at High Point. I mean, we had a dog at the time, and I was very conscious of making sure the dog didn't disturb people because of again the reputation.
So after 5 years, you and Julie, your wife, decided to actually move back to Julie's home on Capitol Hill. That must have been difficult.
Yeah, it was hard, but I'm a real urban animal, and despite our efforts to make High Point, which is kind of West Seattle is kind of suburban, to try and make High Point as urban as we could, there was a lot of things we weren't able to do. We weren't able to not get a grocery store, but there weren't restaurants within walking distance and other services within walking distance. I mean, they were available in West Seattle, but they were available at what they call the junction in West Seattle. So we had to get in our car to do almost everything in our site, and we were kind of spoiled from Capitol Hill, and so it was time to move.
Time to move back.
Yeah, and a lot of Julie's friends lived on Capitol Hill, so we were able to come back and see more of them.
Yeah. Good. What would you say would be your biggest success when it comes to High Point?
It's the green, making the project green. I was already working for the Housing Authority on slightly different things, and there was somebody working running High Point, and my boss decided that he wanted me in that job rather than the guy who was there. So what I was able to do was to add this green element. It was a subject that I had been involved in for the previous 10 or 15 years, and the city had designated High Point as an important area to make sure that the water leaving the site, rainwater leaving the site, would be clean, because it would go into Longfellow Creek and then into Puget Sound. And it was a salmon-bearing creek, and that's kind of sacred in Seattle. So we had to come up with a system to make sure that the water was clean. And I was able to step in and work out with the city of Seattle and our engineers a way to make sure that we could build a natural drainage system. And my role was to make that work in a way that we still got a very traditional looking neighborhood, but the water leaving the site would be clean. And we did that through this, not elaborate, but a major system that we actually found a way, when it rained, for the earth to clean the water, and then the water went in some pipes and then into a pond, and slowly was released into Puget Sound. So I'm not sure that would have happened, that whole natural drainage system, if I hadn't been hired to do this. So I think that was a big part. The other part that I'd like to believe that had an influence on was the success of the for sale housing program, when the builders came in and sold their units, the prices they were getting were quite high. They were above the average in West Seattle, and I think that my previous experience working with developers and how we went about changing the stigma associated with High Point made a big difference in terms of the price of the housing. And of course, one of the things that I didn't realize at the time, that making it green ended up being literally green. I mean, it's really quite beautiful. And I'm not sure it would have looked that good if I hadn't sort of insisted on pushing for some of the green initiatives.
Great. That's good. So I can't ask about your successes without asking about your failures.
Yeah. Well, I think the grocery store that you mentioned was one of them. I don't think we appreciated how important and how together the community was that existed at High Point before we got there, and why we would meet with people and talk to them and listen to what they said. I don't think I really appreciated that until I got to know the community much better, and I'm not sure we used those connections in that community as well as we could have for the people who were living there. I'm sure I could think of some other things.
That's okay. I don't want you to have to sit here and list failures. Well, this is a great book.
Thank you, Rick.
I really enjoyed it. I know our readers, our listeners are going to truly enjoy this book. I would recommend it highly for anyone who's interested at all in how to achieve a little bit different universe within that idea of mixing the housing, which on its own becomes what community is all about. So, Tom, I want to thank you for coming in today. This has been great, and I want to encourage everyone to read High Point, the inside story of Seattle's first green mixed income neighborhood. Thanks, Tom.
Great, thank you.
Bet.
Tom J. Phillips' book, High Point, the inside story of Seattle's first green mixed income neighborhood, will be in the catalog of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library soon. It'll be available as an audiobook with the class ID DB19208. We'll let you know when it's available in a later episode. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you're qualified for our services, visit WTBBL.org or call us Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at 206-615-0400. or toll free at 800-542-0866. Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, based in Seattle, Washington. This episode's interview was conducted by volunteer Rick Sipe. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.